The American Revolution, splitters.
Yeah.
It's a war that I'm only just beginning to learn about. Well, today, once more on the Redcoat History podcast and YouTube channel, we're joined by author Robbie McNiven to talk about his latest book on the 33rd Regiment of Foot during that war. The 33rd were arguably Britain's most elite regiments of the era, probably not including the Foot Guards. In fact, they were so good they were known as the pattern, in other words, the pattern that other infantry regiments should be based on. They fought in almost every major battle of the Revolution. Their colonel was none other than Charles Cornwallis, famous in America as the man who surrendered at Yorktown. But despite this, he was an excellent officer that cared about his men and was determined to forge the 33rd into a unit to be proud of. I've put a link to Robbie's book in the description below. Okay, let's get stuck in.
So the 33rd missed the very start of the Revolutionary War. They just won in North America at Lexington and Concord, and they missed Bunker Hill. Cornwallis is with the regiment in the UK, and he's quite eager to get over to North America because he's a professional soldier. He knows that's where the action is unfolding, and that's where he wants to be. So he manages to make sure that he is given command of a reinforcement detachment that's sent out from Ireland right at the start of 1776. So the 33rd arrives in time to basically fight the rest of the war, which they're heavily involved in. They're at every major action and a lot of little actions as well. They're part of a reinforcement contingent that's deployed, and their first engagement is actually in the south at Charleston. They're part of the debacle of trying to capture Sullivan's Island, but they aren't really heavily engaged in that action. And then they move north with the army, and their first major fight is at Long Island, which is one of the biggest battles of the war.
Is this the right map here on screen, Robbie? Have I got the right map?
That is the one, yes. So that's showing the whole New York campaign, and it kind of starts at Long Island and then it carries on for the next 2 months, going through New York City and then north, and then eventually driving the Continental forces off through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. But the 33rd are chosen at the start of that campaign for special privileges, probably because Cornwallis has managed to bring them up to such a high standard during the pre-war years and during their training. So they're deployed with the Army's vanguard, which contains really the best units. So the composite light infantry and grenadier battalions form the vanguards of the Army. They're going to be the first ones engaged. And the 33rd and the 42nd Foot, so the what becomes the Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment, they are also put into the vanguard as kind of a backup. So they're going to be going in first. And they do that at Long Island. The army is very adverse to the concept of attacking continental-held defences head-on. So they perform a very wide flanking manoeuvre to the east and sort of catch the Continentals off guard, swing round and roll up their line and drive them back. And the 33rd are involved in this right at the forefront of the action. So yeah, they swing round and they drive in the Continental flank, and they pursue Continental forces to their defences in Brooklyn Heights, which is where they've got a second line of defences, and they want to attack that as well, but the senior commanders ride up quickly and say don't attack that because we've probably overextended and it could turn victory into defeat, and they have to be restrained a little bit. So it's a promising first major battle for the regiment, and it kind of sets the tone not only for the regiment but how the army fights as a whole, trying to outmaneuver enemy forces, basically.
Yeah, so we've got this map on screen from your book, which shows all of the major engagements. So they've been down at Charleston. They've now just fought at Long Island and around New York. What was next for the 33rd?
So after that, the army kind of secures New York and its major base of operations for the rest of the war, really. And the primary objective is to trap and destroy the Continental Army and George Washington, which George Washington knows, and he's extremely good at maintaining pressure on the Crown forces while avoiding being drawn into one major engagement where he might be sort of overwhelmed. So that is basically the tone of the rest of the war, really, is trying to force major destructive battles on the Continental Army. And to be fair, there are still a lot of pitched engagements which the 33rd are involved in. So after New York, they spend some time in New York itself or the environs. The plan for the next year is to capture Philadelphia, which is the capital of the Continental Congress. And so they are involved in the successful capture of that city. There's another major battle at Brandywine, which has very similar tactical choices to the ones undertaken at Long Island. So a diversionary force is used to pin the Continentals into what they think is going to be the main offensive, and then a large flanking maneuver is made round the right flank of the Continental Army. Again, the 33rd are involved in this flanking maneuver, and they kind of crash into the Continentals just as they're redeploying to try and face this new threat. They realize what's happening in time, just about, but they're kind of too late, and again, they're broken by the offensive. The 33rd aren't right in the front line of this, the way they were at Long Island, but they are called up towards the end, just as the rear guard of the Continentals is making its last stand. So they engage them and drive them off, and that kind of marks the end of that engagement.
Is that them just at T under Dilworth? Is that them?
Yes, that is correct. So the little village of Dilworth is kind of close to where the last rear guard of the Continentals is, and they clash with them just as it's getting dark, and then the nighttime kind of cuts off any further action, any further pursuit. So after that, the Continentals withdraw and abandon Philadelphia, and the British occupy Philadelphia. And much to their shock, that doesn't signal the end of the war, because the center of power isn't really located in the capital city the way it is in Western Europe. The rebellion is happening all over the colonies at this point. So capturing Philadelphia is a blow towards the revolutionary cause, but it doesn't signal the end of the fighting. So having realized that Philadelphia, holding it doesn't actually render much strategic advantage, the British abandon the city the next year, and the army pulls back to New York. And that's when the next major battle occurs for the 33rd. They kind of have to do the opposite of what they did at Brandywine. They are actually part of the rear guard in this case. So the army is withdrawing overland, trying to get to Sandy Hook to then catch a boat to New York, which they were already occupying. And the Continentals engagement at Monmouth. And it's a very hard-fought battle in extreme temperatures. I think there's about 50 or 60 dead from both sides just from heat stroke. And the 33rd aren't involved in most of the fighting, but towards the end of it, as the British are performing a fighting withdrawal, they come up. It's unclear if they're actually ordered to advance or if they do it on their own initiative. But they come up and they rescue basically the last regiment out of the area, one of the Grenadier battalions. They intercede and drive off the Continental troops briefly and gives them enough time to withdraw. And then the army is able to safely evacuate to New York. After that, it's 1779, and that's a fairly quiet year in terms of overall campaigns. Both armies are, their center of power is around New York, and the British know that if they leave it, they can't really force Washington to engage, and Washington knows he's not strong enough to just attack New York. The 33rd are, however, very nearly destroyed in a freak incident. They are garrisoning one of two small forts on the Hudson River, just north of New York. And there's a fort on either side of the river, one on the east bank, one on the west. They're garrisoning the one on the east. And Washington identifies these two forts as they're sort of a bit isolated, and they're outposts, essentially. They can't be easily supported by the rest of the army. So he mounts a daring assault on both forts. The one on the river on the west side is successful, and the troops there, mostly I think it's the 17th Regiment, are captured. It's a bit of a disaster. Not the whole regiment, but a good chunk of the regiment and a few other detachments are taken prisoner. The attack on the east bank fortuitously fails. The 33rd are kind of they catch wind that the fort on the west bank is under attack, and they stand to with great alacrity. And the small number of cannons in the fort are well handled, so they are able to. The fort doesn't actually then come under assault, the attack force, the attacking Continental force kind of moves up and then sees that the defenders are kind of ready, which wasn't the case with the West Bank fortress. So they kind of stick around for a couple of days, but by this point, reinforcements are coming up from New York, so they abandon it, and the 33rd are rescued, which could have been a very different end to their war if they'd all been taken prisoner a couple of years prior to Yorktown. And that's kind of a big deal for the Continentals, because that's a rare case of them going on the offensive and storming a sort of a well-held British position. And then the East Bank is the fort is called Verplanks. It was originally a Dutch crossing point in the river. But I don't really think there's probably not many images of Verplanks, because the whole thing is famous because Stony Point is the one that was captured, and kind of nothing technically happens at Verplanks apart from it isn't captured. So yeah, 1779, the regiment basically manages to avoid destruction. 1780, the British decide to shift focus south to the Carolinas. There's a belief that North and South Carolina have a large loyalist population who will rise up and support British troops once they return. There are more loyalists in the Carolinas than there are elsewhere, but there aren't actually enough willing to do fighting, it emerges, once the army gets there. So that campaign fails, but it's also where the 33rd kind of win their biggest laurels of the war. So Cornwallis himself is in command of that southern campaign. He has command of the entire army there. And the 33rd play a prominent role in major events, particularly the two largest battles at Camden and Guilford Courthouse. So Camden is the said by some to be the greatest British victory of the war, certainly the most complete one. In some ways, it's kind of uninspiring in terms of tactics, because all Cornwallis does is just launch a frontal assault and relies on the superiority of the British line regiments to just drive off the Americans, which is what they do. But the 33rd and the regiment they're brigaded with, the 23rd, who are also considered to be a very good regiment, they are responsible for caving in the left flank of the Continental forces. It's actually mostly militia on the left flank, who normally aren't particularly steady troops when it comes to linear warfare. So the militia break in front of the 23rd and the 33rd, who then wheel round and engage the Continentals on the right flank, their left flank. And it's extremely fierce fighting for about half an hour, but eventually the Continentals give way as well.
These rustics are so inept. Nearly takes the honor out of victory.
And it's a complete rout. The American army is just basically destroyed. The American General Gates is one of the first people to run away and turns up miles and miles away, reporting his own defeat. And yes, the 33rd are hailed as having played the most vital role in winning that. The Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which happens about 7-8 months later, March 1781, and that is an extremely hard fought and bloody battle. It's famous as being a kind of Pyrrhic victory, in so much as the British drive off the Continental forces but suffer more casualties in the process. So at that engagement, the Continental Commander, General Greene, his idea is to basically force the British to assault 3 separate lines, knowing that the first line they'll probably break through, but then they'll be pretty tired and disorganized by the time they reach the second line. And if they manage to break through that, then they'll be really exhausted and broken up by the time they reach the third line. And his idea is that, the third line will then win him the battle. And the British, as they did at Camden, they kind of just go straight in. The 33rd are on the extreme left flank, so they have difficulties in so much as they're having to attack the troops directly in front of them, but because the Continental line is longer, it overlaps, so they're also having to stave off flanking attacks on the left and maintain the coherency of the overall line. And this is all happening in forested terrain, so they're having to employ light infantry tactics, which they were very conversant in by this point in time. But they do it. The army as a whole manages it. They break the first line, they carry on into the second line, they break the second line, and then they carry on into the third line. The 33rd are actually the first unit to make contact with the third line. Things have become very disjointed in the forest and in the woodlands. So the 33rd emerge. The third line is actually on a small hill beyond the forest. So the 33rd emerge from the forest first. They're the first unit to make the breakthrough. And they, rather than wait for any other units to come up, they push ahead straight away and attack the third line, and are extremely punished for this aggression, because the 39ers, the Continentals there by this point in the war, are quite experienced themselves, and they're, in a good defensive position. They drive back the 33rd. This is one of the only times that the regiment is bested in open combat and forced to retreat. They pull back to the edge of the forest where they rally and kind of engage in some long-range, long-distance shooting. Unfortunately, the commander of the 33rd in the field, so Cornwallis is the overall colonel, but in the field they're led by their Lieutenant Colonel Webster, a fellow Edinburgh Scot, who's extremely well thought of and had brigade commands and was seen as extremely competent, but his luck runs out here. He's shot in the knee, and he doesn't die immediately, but he perishes of his wounds a few days later. So the 33rd are driven back at this point, but they do rally, and then the rest of the army makes it through the woodlands and commences its attack on the 3rd Continental Line. And after much bloodshed and struggle, the Continentals do withdraw, leaving the British master of the field and master of a lot of dead bodies. After that, Cornwallis decides to shift focus to Virginia, so a bit further north, and he throws himself into Virginia, where the army sort of moves back and forth the countryside, freeing slaves and burning plantations and things like that. Kind of unclear at this point what Cornwallis is doing, because there's the strategic concept of British High Command is very disjointed, and there's no real clear view. It's clear that the idea that there's going to be a big loyalist uprising in the south has kind of been over-exaggerated, and that isn't going to happen. But Cornwallis isn't withdrawn from the south. He kind of just carries on. So he ravages Virginia, essentially, and then he sets up base at Yorktown, which initially seems like a very good idea because it's a port, it's a coastal area, which means he has easy access to the sea, which means he has easy access to the Royal Navy, which normally are the vital link which keeps the army supplied in times of duress. He knows that if Yorktown is besieged, worst case scenario, and he can't hold out, he can simply evacuate via the Royal Navy and they can return to New York. And then the French arrive, and that changes everything, because the French have a navy, unlike the rebel Americans. And the arrival of a French fleet outside Yorktown was not what the British were expecting. The Royal Navy tries to break through a French blockade and fails. Washington realizes that he's got this opportunity to defeat an army, a British army, so he leaves where he's encamped outside New York, takes his army south, lays siege to Yorktown. So at this point it's being attacked by the French Navy on the coast, and the Continentals have it bottled up inland. There's fairly poor communication between Cornwallis and the British Commander-in-Chief with the main British Army in New York, Sir Henry Clinton, who doesn't really seem to appreciate the severity of the situation. There's also some bad beef between Clinton and Cornwallis, which maybe causes him to react a bit more slowly than he should have done. So by the time Clinton gets ready to head south and try and relieve Cornwallis, it's kind of all over. The Continentals have a lot of artillery. They're bombarding Yorktown constantly. Food's running out. There's disease. The Continentals capture some of the outer positions of the fortifications defending Yorktown, and basically the Crown forces are left with no choice other than to surrender, which is probably the second biggest defeat the British suffered during the war, after Saratoga, which was an earlier defeat up north along the Hudson River in 1777. So in 1781 at Yorktown, Cornwallis surrenders. The 33rd with the army that surrenders. They've been whittled down by a year and a half of extremely hard campaigning. I think there's only a couple of hundred of them left at this point. And yes, the scene that plays out in a million documentaries and textbooks and stuff as the British forces march out, lay down their arms, and are marched into captivity. And in a lot of popular history, that's where the war ends, but in reality that's mistaken, because it carries on for 2 more years. There are some pretty major engagements and battles outside of North America that have a very important bearing on how the war ends for Britain, if not for the Americans. So clearly the Americans have secured their independence at this point, but things like the Great Siege of Gibraltar are still ongoing. The Battle of the Saints, which is a major naval victory for Britain in the Caribbean, which kind of ensures that they keep hold of things like Jamaica, That's very important from a British perspective, but it doesn't really matter to the Americans, so it's not studied as much.